Well, hi, I'm Henry Harrison, and I'm the co-founder and chief scientist at Garrison. And I spend about 50% of my time working with customers in the mainstream commercial market. And I spend the other 50% of my time dealing with customers in the classified government space in the UK, the US, and a variety of other countries. I'm aware that most people who work in the commercial sector don't have that experience of the classified government experience, the classified government environment. So I thought it might be fun to get a group of people together, all of whom have got that kind of combined experience in both of those worlds, to reflect on the similarities and differences between them. Are they fundamentally different, or are there things that either of those worlds could learn from the other? So I've got with me today, I've got Bernard Parsons with me. He's the CEO of bcrypt. Bernard supplies high assurance solutions to both the classified government world and also into mainstream commercial organizations. We've got James Chappell. James is the co-founder and the chief innovation officer at Digital Shadows. In a previous life, James worked as a consultant protecting classified systems for the UK government. I've got Phil Huggins, and Phil is an independent consultant working as a CISO and a risk analyst. He today works most closely with fintech and health tech startup businesses. But in previous roles, Phil also had experience working for sensitive government organizations. And finally, Russell Kempley, who's currently Chief Security Officer at CyberOwl, where his focus is on protecting critical infrastructure. And over the past 10 years, Russell's been at the heart of threat intelligence and cyber incidents across both, I think, commercial and high-end classified government. So welcome to all of you, and thanks for joining me today. I think maybe just to get this topic off the ground, James, I might turn to you and talk a little bit about threat intelligence, because that's what you do. And it seems to me that if we go back 10 years ago, threat intelligence was broadly something that kind of government intelligence organizations did. And here you are running a business doing threat intelligence and supplying that to a wide range of commercial organizations. You've been doing that for about the last 10 years. How do you see that kind of like that change that's happened from it being a specifically government thing to being a commercial concern?
It's been a very interesting evolution. So yeah, it's been a very interesting evolution. So I think when we first started, we had sort of technical services that were in the commercial space that were creating a lot of data, and there's this concept of feeds that existed sort of quite early on. And I think sort of in the early days, people were sort of saying a data feed is the same as intelligence. And if you take the very broadest definition of intelligence, sort of reducing uncertainty to stop a harm from taking place, you could argue that some of those things were a form of intelligence. But I think what we've observed is in the commercial space, there's been a real sense of maturing going on. So we've seen people like SANS, for example, start to create professionalization in intelligence for cybersecurity specifically in a commercial space. And it's all about taking, you've also sort of seen things like the King's Masters course, for example, sprout up in intelligence, and people from that course taking interest in cybersecurity. So we started to see what people would class as tradecraft used in sort of the government space, then applied to sort of cybersecurity space, and it's become this big sort of commercial thing. So,
and some of the techniques you're using are techniques and technologies, I think, that originally came out of that government space, aren't they?
So yeah, I think it's actually the techniques. So things like analysis of competing hypotheses, for example, or things like grading sources based on a 5x5 matrix, are things that are sort of published in the public domain now, whereas before they were sort of very much part of the government domain. And I think this opening up of best practice has been a really positive thing for our industry. It means that instead of all the marketing fluff and FUD that you get with products, you're actually talking about real risks, you're talking about real threats, and you're talking about the real impact they have on the people who use those services. So it's
Russell,
very positive.
You've been kind of at the heart of threat intelligence and incidents. Do you think that some of that change that's happened is because of a convergence of threats in those markets, or is it other factors that's driven that kind of what James has just been talking about there?
I think there is certainly convergence on both ends of things, both in the threat and in the tooling. But I think there remain some key differences as well. So just reflecting on what James talked about, my experience of working in commercial spaces is that businesses are still largely focusing upon rather sort of more short-term intelligence and things that they can act upon and do today, which is probably different from the government space, where they tend to be looking a little bit further out, trying to get on the inside of sort of a more limited number of key adversaries. That's also changing, but I think there's still some differences there, and I think that talks to the kind of the timescales and the horizons on which these two the enterprise and government space both work. And in terms of the convergence of the threats themselves, I think rather than necessarily it being that that one threat has ported, or one set of actors has ported from one domain to the other, I think it's more about the techniques. So criminals, to a large extent, would still focus on enterprises because that's where money is, and that's what criminals are largely interested in. And states focus on states because that's what they do. But the convergence is because the criminals are now using state-like techniques, and so what used to be a tradecraft that the states had to use against their adversaries now becomes useful to the enterprise world too.
That's interesting. So okay, I think there's some, at least some of it then is down to convergence of threat, but a lot of it is about convergence of technique. But certainly, James, what you're saying there is things that you're doing that were originally really a government space thing. Bernard, in your world, I mean, I think one of the things you do is chair the High Assurance UK body, and I guess from my experience in the two markets, one of the big differences between them is the attention that's paid to assurance in the government space, which we really don't tend to see so much in the commercial space. Is that a view you'd concur with, or do you see something different?
Yeah, I do see that as being a big area of difference. Just picking up on one of the topics of convergence before I move into that, I think that a lot of the customers that we work with in the government supply chain are experience of convergence of the threat actor community as well. So I think that might be somewhat sector specific, and it's certainly from a government perspective. What we hear from them very often is that actually the supply chain is the top of their priority in terms of their own threat and where they see their threat actors focusing. So in terms of assurance, we do see, a very different history both within the public and private sector, and obviously government with expertise in areas like the National Cybersecurity Centre, they've got the capability of really carrying out an assessment of security controls and components to a level that's not realistic for much of the private sector. That being said, it is a world that is seeing a lot of transformation, because the approaches that were historically taken to gaining assurance no longer work in today's world, because systems are much more complex, much more interconnected, much more diverse, larger scale, move faster. And so some of the standards and techniques that were developed for more traditional high-grade technologies just don't apply today. So we are seeing some very good practice in some of the exemplar government projects, and there's a real opportunity, I think, in the UK for that to then be shared with the private sector. So going back to James's point about one of the positive things he's seen is an opening up of best practice. I think there's a frustration that from a component evaluation and assurance perspective, perhaps that opening up hasn't yet moved as much and as fast as it could.
Cool. Well, I think we'll come back to some of that in a bit. But Phil, I want to pick up on something that Russell said, which also joins up with Bernard's comment. And I want to talk about agility, because I think, Russell, you suggested that timescales in the kind of national security classified world tend to be longer than in the commercial world. And certainly there's a widespread perception of that. But certainly what I'm seeing, Bernard, is that there's quite a big push on in government organizations to try and bring more agility into this space as they try and deal with today's world. I mean, Phil, and I know that agility is quite close to your heart in the way that your organizations try and work. How do you see that difference between those two worlds? And by the way, you're on mute just at the moment.
My experience in government is a few years ago now. And back then, it was just prior to the big GDS change, the big focus on agility, the adoption of smaller suppliers, that sort of thing. It was still big integrated suppliers doing high assurance systems and taking years to do it. Having worked in some large scale commercial organizations, they didn't want the same level of assurance activity and cost, but they were looking for similar levels of outcome. They wanted to know what they were buying was the right thing. What I'm finding with more agile tech-first businesses these days is they are prepared for things to go wrong. They're prepared to adapt to a changing environment. It will be very interesting to see some of these smaller tech-first businesses handle a nation state taking them on. And actually you go back a few years and you see Google took a big old smack in the chops on that one, and had to learn that lesson. But what I think there has been a trade-off is the ability to adapt, the ability to absorb harms, and the ability to change what you're doing in response to what's happening around you, especially with the adoption of a lot of service-based, very complex architectures, because most of your systems aren't run by you anymore. They're run by your suppliers, cloud suppliers of various forms, SaaS and IaaS and the rest. And that has meant a lot lower assurance. You know, I can't go and touch every bit of tin that runs my system in a rack somewhere and make sure that I know where it is and who bought it and the rest of it. But interestingly, my experience of having worked with cloud providers and then building systems on them, probably better outcomes.
It's really interesting that though, because obviously, so 10 years ago, again, like probably James, when you were kind of actively looking after government systems, very much kind of the pattern of government systems was we have, you know, we have air-gapped systems. We don't connect them to anything. That's the end of the story. And in fact, you know, still hear that. Just like a few months ago, I was on a panel back in the days when you could be on a panel, you know, physically in New York, and someone from a government organization there was asked kind of like, well, how do you protect your classified data? And they say, well, we just don't connect it to anything. And my perception is that that's not true anymore, because there's a massive push from mobility, and they are buying cloud services nowadays in some ways, and trying to fight that fight as to how they do assure services that are delivered by suppliers in the cloud, rather than just throwing their hands up and going, well, we can't do that.
Yeah. It's quite interesting. I think the sort of, you've seen the NCSC coming out with things like patterns for sort of cloud services. You've seen a lot of work going on. Digital transformation is happening everywhere. It's kind of unavoidable. You can't avoid it. So, and I think expectations of consumers of technology services are molded by their experiences as consumers. So then when they come into even a government workplace, they have demands, as we've seen with video conferencing apps in the current time. They now have a demand and an expectation which is much higher and can't be delivered by sort of commercially available off-the-shelf sort of bits of tin that are air-gapped. So it's how do you meet those expectations without doing it? And the answer is you can't. So you then sort of, I believe if you don't currently work in the sort of the secure government environments, but what you've seen in the news are sort of things like, you know, the choice of video conferencing apps. They've got one for one set of things and another for another set of things. So it's very interesting looking at people like MI5 sort of talk about how they're working in the current environment. Their employees have to be remote. They have to be able to connect things. That air-gapped situation won't work for MI5 in that area. So it's I think government is being forced to adapt, and I think people like the NCSC are doing a good job of helping people know how to do that well, and know how they can rely on. In fact, to Phil's point, some of the security controls I actually think are better in some of these infrastructure as a service systems. You can actually get sort of, you know, key management, and you can get really well defined granular access controls if you use them in the right way. And I think government's really beginning to realize that and benefit from that now.
It's interesting though, because Bernard, like I know both you and I are involved in some government projects that we're reasonably familiar with, and what they're doing is per se not classified. It's not secret, but it's not entirely clear what can and can't be talked about in terms of the actual specifics of, for example, how they're doing video conferencing. I know, because I talk to people in places that are not, cleared for secret conversations, that what's being done there isn't secret, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's something that we can talk about on this call. So it definitely makes it hard, I think, for people who are outside that world to be able to compare and contrast, and you're kind of going on slight kind of like hearsay and rumors.
Yeah, I mean, there are programs like the NCSC Advanced Mobile Program or Advanced Mobility, I can't remember which one, which they will talk about publicly. Obviously, there's a level of detail and where it's being used, which won't be discussed openly, but they are certainly pushing that as an example, which is a very good example, I think, of reinforcing James's point there, because what that program is responding to is the requirement to use phones like iPhones, other makes are available, in classified environments. And that was a requirement. There was no ifs and buts because of that consumer experience pressure on the user community. They just need it. And also, when you start to look at other forms of risk, like operational risk in certain scenarios, if the user community don't have that kind of capability available. And so that then automatically pulls these organizations, when you start to connect MDM systems into your infrastructure, the ecosystem that comes with that automatically pulls you into the cloud in a way. That's an example of that being forced on an organization.
And it's interesting, there's a US program called Commercial Technologies for Classified Use, that explicitly tries to go into details of how you might configure that sort of thing for use in US classified environments. Phil, from your perspective in the commercial space, was it ever the case that you were asking government about how they did things? Was that ever a dynamic, or is it always just assumed that fundamentally, they're different worlds with different issues and they have to plow a different furrow?
So they were, what has become clear is they are worlds with similar issues now. Maybe different actors, different goals in place, different infrastructures they're running.
Which is Russell's point about criminals versus.
But they've kind of got the same problems now, which 15 years ago we didn't necessarily think was the same problem that both sides had. The industrialized attacks on banks that had been running for the last 20 odd years, that didn't seem like a government problem. It seemed like, more of a James Bond behind a laptop kind of problem. Now we've got industrialized James Bonds behind laptops, it's, but I don't think there was a lot of interest in the commercial world when government started getting very excited about cyber. So when the government and the Bank of England, for example, started getting very interested around about 2009, using the FT as its intelligence dissemination platform to go and convince boards that cyber was something everybody should worry about. And then there was an immediate, as you can imagine, call from the commercial side. They're saying, well, tell us what's wrong. Tell us what we need to do. Tell us what the answer is. Give us your intelligence. And there was a notable pause in communications, at which point everyone realized that the government intelligence apparatus didn't have the intelligence that would be useful in the commercial world because they weren't watching or monitoring or analyzing the commercial environments. And also, when they did come out and start saying, you need to disconnect that, you need to, quite quickly, people told them to go away and sling their hook because that didn't work. We've already seen, I saw an environment where government recommended that they turn off old browser versions because that was going to dramatically reduce the risk of attack on customers. It was like, well, that's great. Does that mean we can no longer serve the customers that we are regulated to serve who won't update their browsers? Suddenly you've got two parts of governments arguing, saying, well, actually cyber matters, and someone else going, no, customer service matters. And there's been a lot of journey there for government, I think, in trying to.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's been real journey, both because of the communication thing and also because they've been faced with pressures in the last 10 years, like the mobile stuff you were talking about, Bernard, that 10 years ago they would just go like, well, we don't do that. And now it's like, well, we have to do that. So actually they're starting to face many of the same business pressures that that business is facing. And so we seem to be slightly closer perhaps to to the ability to communicate than we were 10 years ago.
Well, and the assurance thing we were talking about earlier was interesting. In general, government did more wide-ranging and better assurance.
Mm-hmm.
Most commercial assurance was and remains, frankly, quite poor. And this is something we've spoken about many times.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
But what was interesting is you would occasionally run across someone in a leadership position in a commercial organization who was an expert in the field, and around them would form a cluster of high assurance activities that were customized and frankly delivered better outcomes than you were getting through the meat grinder in government.
Oh, I'll bet, because I mean, Bernard, you know it well, right? I'm quite a big fan of assurance. I build a high assurance product, but my goodness, government assurance processes are horrific. And if you think the UK is bad, you should see the US, right? I mean, it's a horrible thing to be involved in.
Yes, and it comes from a history of being focused on evaluating things like link encryptors, which are going to be operating in a very constrained environment and have very constrained requirements. And you can have a set of mathematicians think about what they really care about in that kind of context. But when the same processes are applied to today's real world scenarios, they fall short, and that's what's really been behind a lot of the transformation that I know you're seeing.
I mean, to give the UK government credit, they are doing a lot of work in this area, and we've been working quite closely with them on trying to explore new ways of doing assurance. Which I mean are quite a big contrast with we're also engaged with the US government, where you've still got like 1,000-page documents explaining how you should build A or B, which is and I understand why they're doing that, but and I understand the history, but it's pretty hard to work with. I mean, I think the other thing that's hindered communication historically, Russell, is the obsession in government with secrecy. I mean, because fundamentally, embedded deep into the DNA of every civil servant since probably 2,000 years ago is the idea of keeping secrets. And so cybersecurity is always caught up with that. And then they come and talk to commercial organizations, they go, well, we don't really have secrets, right? We're mostly worried about integrity. And that's what, I mean, your current world is all about integrity, right? In critical infrastructure.
Well, I mean, businesses are, their focus is on their shareholders and their customers and making sure that they can deliver the services they need to in order to stay in business and be profitable. And it's, I think in business, that the tension between the kind of business mission and the security mission they're probably further apart than they are in government for that exact reason. As you say, civil servants and government sort of intrinsically understands the need for security in all forms, but in cyber as well as anything else. Whereas in business, it's it's often seen as a hindrance sometimes to actually being able to get out and take a new business case to market or engage with customers in any way. And Phil raised some good points in financial services around the tension where you have to be able to provide services. There are recent regulations around data sharing between different firms that put pressure on them to share in the sectors where I'm currently working in critical national infrastructure, in order to drive efficiency from that infrastructure and to get better service or to be more energy efficient or whatever it might be. There's been an absolute huge revolution in terms of the need to get data from the control systems that were formerly in sort of air-gapped islands and put that into the business realm so that you can work out how to use those assets more efficiently. And that's forcing air gaps to be bridged and creating cybersecurity is a much more kind of key thing then to worry about in these sectors. So I think I'm not sure there's necessarily good answers everywhere yet. And actually, one thing which I was going to mention is interesting is actually lots of the advice that companies follow or turn to, things like NIST or whatever else, comes from government with quite a government lens. And then there's quite a lot of difficulty in working out how to map that advice into commercial solutions where you have things like cloud, you have the Internet of Things. I mean, in energy now, the smart meters and everything else is extending their networks right out into the edge in a way that government hasn't had to address for itself. So I think that some of these sectors in the commercial space have a really hard time being kind of both a bit governmenty and a bit commercial, and trying to work out how to secure themselves in the middle.
Yeah, that's interesting. Maybe that's the place where we like really fight this battle to get the communications going between the two sides. I mean,
standards.
Sorry, Phil, go ahead.
What Russell brings up there. Traditionally, standards have been written from practice, and they've been written by people working for organisations who were big enough to have people who understand security and have time on their hands to go and write a standard, which is generally meant banks. Maybe a few big organizations. So a lot of the commercial standards are really reflecting current practices or recent practices in banks. And like Russell was saying, things like NIST reflect a government view on the world. Neither of those are the most agile or forward-looking or new technology adopting organizations in the world. And neither of them are particularly good at transformation. And I think what we see in our standards is, some really good work that doesn't necessarily always apply in a more rapidly changing environment where you don't control things, which is very different to a bank and a government site.
Can I ask whether there's any experience in the panel of whether the approach taken with the NCSE cyber assessment framework has been any more successful in terms of well, it's not a standard, it is a framework, but to the earlier point about standards being written with a government lens, I think there is this attempt there with the cyber assessment framework supporting the NIS regulations to be, first of all, outcomes based, but then also leverage centres of expertise, if that's the right term, the competent authorities, which should understand the issues and how to map that framework to the sector of concern. I wondered whether there's any experiences of that being a more successful approach outside of finance, of course, which isn't covered by NIS.
Yeah,
and I think you're right in that there have been efforts made. I mean, that I don't think we're the first to identify this collision of standards and practice and the government and commercial worlds. So there is definitely effort underway. Some of what NCSC is doing with its assessment, some of what the CAF is doing in relation to applying the NIS directive has some potential, but I think we're probably still a little bit away from knowing if that's going to solve it. Whether it is forward looking enough, whether it anticipates how quickly businesses are changing in the digital world.
Yeah, my concern is, and maybe this is me revealing my true colours as a techie ultimately, that I've seen quite a lot of good work happening at the kind of abstract kind of risk management level, but when push comes to shove, a lot of this actually depends on technology, and the technological, the great advantage, well, I don't know if it's an advantage, but the unique perspective it seems to me that governments have is that they spend about half their time trying to break into other people, which isn't an experience that most other organizations have really. And so at a technical level, that gives them quite an interesting insight. And that's the bit where you tend not to get the communication, because it does become uncertain about what they are and they're not happy to share about how they actually do things as they're trying to navigate their own battles between efficiency and security. So you could do the assessment, but actually some of the things you might choose to do are things that quite a lot of people just don't know you could even try to do. Do you think, does that ring true to anybody, or do you think that's just a techie kind of like pushing their own agenda?
So I think there is an interesting analogue in the banks in that they've been in a fist fight with organised crime since about 2000 online.
Yeah.
So whereas you've got the intelligence apparatus of governments competing online, stealing, gaining access, all the rest of that good stuff they do, you've got banks and organised crime duking it out, raising the standard, improving the attacks, improving the controls, changing the focus of the targets, and it's a different fight. They're not both boxing, if that makes sense. Government and banks are not both boxing. Somebody's doing Krav Maga and somebody else is like street fighting with a stick, and so it's different fights. And I think there's a lot to learn from both.
Yeah.
And I think they have very different perspectives. But again, they also are both resourced for those fights. You know, they know who their enemy is. They've got the resources to an extent to be able to take it toe to toe. Almost every commercial organization doesn't.
Yeah, but even the banks, I mean, they're resourced for that fight. But I remember having a conversation with one of the cyber leaders for a large bank who was kind of saying in despair. It's like, why should we have to protect ourselves against these nation states that are now trying to break into us? It's not fair.
So
but they do now have to do that, unfortunately for them.
I was once sworn at by a chief risk officer in a FTSE 100 financial services firm who, on being told that he had to worry about China, told me that he wasn't a intelligence agency.
Yeah, exactly.
To work on behalf of Her Majesty, and there's a lot more swearing than that involved. And he had a point. His job is a global business to make money.
Absolutely, and I'm totally sympathetic. But unfortunately, when you've got nation states acting like criminals, it's quite hard to. It does seem like that landscape's got a bit blurred now. But is that exaggerated, Russell? Do you think that's exaggerated from a threat perspective?
I mean, there certainly are overlaps. There certainly are nations who will use criminal techniques, who will use the cover of a criminal-looking attack to hide their other objectives. The beauty of cyberspace from an attacker's perspective is it's very difficult to do attribution. It's very difficult to be sure what you're facing. But we know the financial services organizations and many commercial organizations do see attacks that appear to be state in origin. The question is when you go to the board and you talk about it, you have to explain the impact of it. Well, the financial ones aside, often the impacts become a little bit muddled. What does that intellectual property cost me? If I'm going to go and do business in China anyway, would I just hand over the information if they asked for it because the market's worth more to me than the information is? It becomes a lot more nuanced and more muddled, I think, in terms of deciding how to put a value on those impacts, which in government terms is much more straightforward. That information cannot be passed to the enemy under any circumstances, so it's much more clear cut. But in business, those attacks exist, but understanding the impact of them and therefore how much attention and effort you should put into dealing with them actually gets quite complicated.
There's somewhere it's a bit simpler, isn't there? It's like when we've got nation states just breaking into banks and trying to steal money, that seems like slightly less of a complicated scenario to deal with.
Yeah, I mean the banks definitely care about losing money. I think actually, critical national infrastructure again is another interesting place where many times you'll speak to organizations there and they're not particularly well funded to do nation state level cybersecurity, and they'll say, well, if we had a breach, if we became a victim of a state as a proxy to target the infrastructure or the well-being of the UK or whoever it might be, they'll say we're not resourced to handle that threat. We expect the government to step in, and that's another set of
well, that's a whole other set of problems because actually the government's not organised to step in at that point. So we could spend 40 minutes talking purely about that. But I wanted to kind of end up just. I think we've got a bit of a split here because some of us are vendors. We work for vendors, and some of you or either are or have been working on the other side of the equation. And I certainly my experience is very different selling into the two markets because in the commercial world, two things happen. Firstly, it's incredibly noisy. It's very, very hard to get a meeting with anybody because basically every other email in the CISO's inbox is from a vendor saying, hello, can I meet you, right? So, but if you do manage to get to meet with them, there's a presumption from the fact that you've gone to the effort to meet with them that you've got a decent security product and that it's worth talking to you. And go to talk to government, it's completely different. And because once I get to talk to them, the presumption, you go and meet government for the first time, the presumption is that you're lying through your teeth and that you must absolutely not have anything worth buying at all. And it's quite stark, the difference. I suspect you see that as well, Bernard, don't you, when you turn up in those two markets?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the only kind of nuance I'd add is just there is quite a spectrum of experience within government. I think a lot of this conversation has been.
I'm talking about the top end of government here, not. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and of course, yeah, we can have a very different experience at the in other parts of government. We've had encounters where we've had people in technical roles that are buying into a vendor's literature that claims that they have zero vulnerabilities because they have no published APIs, and this was bought into. So yeah, I do agree, but with that
caveat. Russell, do you think you're insufficiently skeptical and being overly talked into things by smooth-tongued salesmen? I rather doubt it, knowing you.
Yeah, well, when I've been on the buying side of that discussion, talking to vendors, I think probably few of them left feeling a little worse for wear. But I think actually there is something, other than my personality aside, that actually in a commercial setting, the incentives are slightly different. You're often looking for a win. You're looking to bring someone who's going to make you look good. And the brand and the slick sales pitch works well to your boss as much as it does to anybody else. And since it's quite hard to prove whether something works or not in this space, then that actually is almost worth as much to you as doing a kind of thorough check. What do you actually win by sending a salesperson away feeling sorry for themselves? Well, you've got to wait another 4 to 6 months before you find the next possible solution to get the audit point off your list of things you have to deal with. So I think kind of commercial buying is and commercial security departments have some kind of slightly strange messages at times. I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? But I mean, like Phil, is that your message to vendors? Help me sell, don't help me secure. Then.
Well, I mean, interestingly, I've probably had more engagements over the last year and a half working for security vendors, helping them with business cases, than I've had actually doing security for people. I think there is a massive problem in the commercial security vendor market. I think the commercial security vendor market is too full of solutions, too full of vendor money, VC money. I think there is a lack of time in the day for CISOs to deal with it. And interestingly, because there isn't a national technical authority sitting in the center giving out certificates of good or bad, nobody knows what any of this stuff can do. And if you want to run a national level assurance scheme for your business, great, you are now working in one of the big retail banks because they're the only ones that can afford to do it. And they do it, they just can't talk about it. There is no commercial equivalent providing that check and balance. So what you've got is thousands of people shouting at you. They've got the solution to every problem you have. You've got solutions to solve. And, what can you do? You've just got to get on with it. And I think in the commercial world, it is the vendor conversation which drives the agenda for security. I think in the government world, that isn't quite the case. I think that is a massive difference in terms of what can be done and said and filtered and focused on.
Well, I think that might be quite a good place to end this, because I think there's a whole other chat we could have about that, and maybe we'll line that up for another time. But I found that pretty interesting. I hope that our listeners will find that interesting. Thank you very much to all of you for taking part in this.
Thank you for organising.
No, well, it's been a new format to explore for us, and hopefully it's going to be of interest to our listeners. Thanks very much, everybody, and goodbye.